Lightroom is a powerful photo editing tool that's meant for photographers that want to do a lot of post-processing on photos really quickly. Today I'm going to go through and show you some of the core functionality. One thing to note is that this is Lightroom Classic. There's a new version of Lightroom that is more cloud-based, but I'm going to be going through the Classic version, which uses a database to store your images. At the top, there's a few different tabs. The main ones you're going to be using are Library, which is where you do all the sorting and importing of your files, and Develop, which is where you do all of the post-processing. I'm going to go down to Import, which is going to bring up a dialog box, and then I'm just going to go ahead and select the folder that contains the photo that I want to import. I'm importing a RAW file, which means that it's straight from the camera without post-processing. This type of file can only be opened by Photoshop and Lightroom, and needs some base processing in order to be able to turn into a real usable image. This is an NEF format because it comes from a Nikon camera. So I selected this folder. If you're taking it off of some kind of disk, you can select that device, and then files that have not been imported will pop up. Then I'm going to go ahead and select that and click Import. So once it's imported, you can sort it however you want. One technique that I like to really stress is the starring technique. If you have one of these files selected, you can press 1 through 5 to set it a rating. And this is a really good way to call through your images to find the ones that you want to use. And it's good to come up with your own system of how to rate your files. For instance, I use 1 star when it's something that's even vaguely usable, and then 2 stars when I choose it as one of the selected files. 3 stars after I choose it as one of the final files, and then 4 stars after I develop it, and then sometimes 5 stars if there's a second round of developing. So that just helps me go through and sort. You can use these filters down here to find those exact files and figure out what stage of the workflow they are on. So I'm going to go ahead and select this file and then go into the Develop tab. This is where all of the magic is going to take place. See that there's a lot of tools over on this side, and these tools are contained in these different tabs. Most of the stuff that you need is actually in this Basic tab, which is really dedicated to just correcting some basic exposure and color issues. So this is a payoff shot by Ashley Montoya, and it looks really good, but there's definitely some things that can be improved about this. The lighting, for one, is very uneven. See that there's some pretty intense shadows, and it's definitely much brighter on this side than it is on this side. And then the brand yellow isn't really consistent throughout, so we're going to go through and fix all those different things. In the Basics panel, the first thing at the top is some settings for color balance. The first one is for color temperature, which is a slider that goes from more blue to more yellow. So if I slide this towards the blue side, see that things get more blue, and if I slide it towards the yellow side, things get more yellow. A lot of times you're using this to just correct inaccuracies in the photo, but sometimes you actually want to use it as a creative tool. Not so much in products, but a lot of times when you're doing portraits or landscapes, you might turn it to the cool side to get more of an early morning feel, whereas the yellow side will be much warmer and feel like some kind of desert scene. And you'll notice that this type of color grading is used in a lot of movies to create certain feelings and effects. And then the second slider is for tint, which goes between green and magenta. Generally speaking, you're not going to want to play around with this too much. Usually the auto white balance does a pretty good job of selecting the right tint. But if you do feel that you have either a magenta or a green cast to your images, you can slide it in the opposite direction to correct for that tint. And then one of the best tools in this area is this eyedropper. So eyedropper is for selecting a neutral part of your image. And when you select that, it's going to change all the color temperature sliders and color tint slider to correct and bring that target back to a neutral color. So right now my image is definitely a little bit yellow. I know that this background color is supposed to be roughly neutral. So if I click the eyedropper and click on that color, it's going to adjust this to bring me back to neutral. So if you're shooting on a gray seamless, this is a really good way to bring all of your photos to the proper color temperature, but also to create consistency between all of your photos, especially if you're shooting on the same background. Underneath color temperature, we have some exposure settings. The base exposure is just simply for brightening up or darkening your image. So if you shot it a little bit off from what is ideal, you can turn this up or turn this down to correct it. Contrast is to increase or decrease the distance between the darks and the lights. So you can see if I turn contrast up really far, it starts to get really punchy and the colors and textures really jump off the page. If you go too high on it, it's going to start looking a little fake. So you want to make sure you're staying in control. Some photos also have a lot of natural contrast. So in some cases, you might even dial the contrast down. But generally speaking, you're probably going to be dialing this up just a bit, especially with products, because it's going to make things look a little bit more defined. Underneath that, you have some more exposure settings, but these target specific areas. And when I hover over one of them, say the highlights, you can notice that in the histogram, this little section is going to light up. That's showing me the section that's going to be affected by this slider. So the highlights is going to lighten or darken the light parts of the image. So if, for instance, I thought that this highlighted heavy area over here was a little too bright, I can turn the highlights down and you can see it's really targeting that part of the image. Same with shadows, except the shadows is going to target the lower part of the range. So if I bring shadows up, you can see it's going to bring out a lot of the mid grays into this jacket and lessen the effect of some of the deep shadows in this area. A lot of times when you do bring up shadows, it's good to bring down blacks. Blacks is going to really adjust the endpoint of the image. And so sometimes when shadows washes out a lot of the darks, bringing down the blacks can bring that back to make it, more rich and just have like that sufficient contrast to make it look good. Whites is another good setting to use. In some cases, you might bring it down if you just kind of overexpose the shot. You have a lot of things that are sort of blinding you. Other cases, you might bring it up if you have, a photo that just looks really muddy and you want to increase the exposure and the contrast sort of at the same time. So I recommend just kind of playing with some of these settings and getting a feel for how they work. Underneath that, you have presence, and clarity is a really interesting setting. It's extremely powerful, but it can also be a little bit much if you use it too loosely. Basically increases a lot of mid-tone contrast, and the effect is that it brings out a lot of textures and things. So you can see if I jump the clarity up to 100, it starts to feel a little bit plasticky and fake, but it also really helps bring out all the detail and things, which is really nice. So sometimes it works well for things like products, but it's usually not recommended for things like portraits, where you're going to bring out a lot of the imperfections and unevenness in people's skin, which is not going to be very flattering. Generally speaking, you're going to want to keep this pretty much between 0 and maybe plus 30. In some cases, you might go up to plus 50 for products, but you really don't want to go much higher than that. Again, certain photos have a certain baseline clarity, so in some cases, you might not have to raise it at all. In some cases, you might even turn it down a little bit. In a lot of cases with products, you'll probably be raising this a little bit. It's also a really good way to bring out text. I bump this up and you look at sort of this text area. If I slide it up and down, you can really see how it makes that text really readable and contrasty, which is great. And you have vibrance and saturation, which are actually pretty similar things. I recommend mostly sticking with saturation, which just makes your colors more vivid when you turn it up and then less vivid when you turn it down. Vibrance works pretty similar, but it's more, something that's used for like portrait photography, so I generally stick to saturation. And a lot of cases, I'm going to turn saturation a little bit down, because by adding contrast, you're kind of naturally adding some saturation, so sometimes you kind of have to go back and counteract that a little bit by turning it down. So I'm just going to turn that down to -8. I'm going to raise the exposure a little bit as well, and then that's looking a little bit better. Next, I want to show you are some of these targeted tools, and these work pretty similar to the basic area, except you can target those adjustments to specific areas. For instance, the graduated filter will allow me to drag in and make an adjustment to a certain area. So after I drag this adjustment in, I get this toolbar here full of different adjustments, but these adjustments are actually just going to happen in the area that I've selected. So this interface is basically telling me that on this side of the line, this is where the adjustment is going to happen more, and then on this side of the line is where the adjustment's going to happen less. So there's a gradation that happens here where the adjustment's going to happen full strength over on this side of the line, and then not at all on this side of the line. And then in between these two lines, it's going to have a gradated effect. So just as an example, if I turn exposure up to 4 stops, which is really bright, you can see that it's increasing the exposure of this area a whole lot and then not affecting this area much at all. So this is a good way to counteract the fact that this area of the photo was a little bit dark. If I turn this down to 0, you can see where we're kind of starting out. And as I increase the exposure, see that it's starting to lighten up that area and bring this back into being a little more even. I'm also going to turn up the shadows a little bit, and then maybe turn down the blacks just a touch. So when I click close, it's going to apply that filter. And if I ever want to get back to it, I can go back to graduated filters and then click on this little button here to go back and make adjustments to that area. So all these tools are non-destructive. So when you go back, you can make adjustments and it's not going to burn in any of those effects. Another tool that's really similar is the brush tool. And this works in the same way where you're defining an area, but it works by brushing on an adjustment area rather than using a graduated filter. So for instance, if I wanted to brush over this area because I thought the shadows were a little too dark, I can just brush that in. It's not doing anything now because there's nothing actually changing here. But if I turn up exposure up to 4.0, you can see that I brushed in a certain area here. I'm going to turn exposure back down to 0 and then instead going to raise shadows a little bit just to bring out some of the detail in those dark areas. And then once again, when you click close, it's going to apply that brush, but in a non-destructive way. Also at the top, you have the crop tool, which is really useful for obviously just cropping stuff. If you want to type in a certain aspect ratio, you can do that here. This can be really helpful if you are trying to hit a very specific screen size or spread size for your web or print portfolio. You can type that in, and that will let you make sure that you're cropping exactly right for the size of your book. And then there's also a tool here for just a really simple heal and clone brush. So generally speaking, I have this on heal, and if you want to remove a spot, you can do that. It's going to work in a non-destructive way. It's not that powerful, but for instance, I can remove those coins. When I click close, it's going to show me that those are gone. If you do want to do some more major photo editing, you can always right-click on your photo and go to Edit in and Photoshop. This is going to bring up your photo in Photoshop, and then when you do any adjustments and then save the photo, it's going to give you a copy back in Lightroom. So, it's going to have to burn in these Lightroom settings because Photoshop doesn't work in a non-destructive way, but it's still going to save the original. So basically you're going to get a 1 out of 2 and a 2 out of 2. The 2 out of 2 will be a PSD, which came from Photoshop with all those edits made. Underneath the basic section, you have a tone curve. If you like working with curves over sliders, this is the place for you. I generally work with the sliders. And then I really like this section. This is a targeted area for hue, saturation, and luminance, which allows you to make adjustments based on hue ranges. So for instance, if I wanted to desaturate this red color, I can go into saturation, and then under the reds, I can just turn that down, and you can see it's desaturating those reds without desaturating anything else. You can do the same with hue. So for instance, if I wanted to make those reds a little bit more magenta, I can slide it this way, and it's finding all those red areas and changing the hue towards the cooler direction. Then same with luminance. So if I wanted to make the reds a little bit brighter, I can slide this up. It's going to find those red areas and make those areas a little brighter. And you can see when I turn this up and down, it's also affecting a little bit of the skin tones. So you have to be careful that you're not, unintentionally doing extra adjustments. And then over in this section, this will allow you to target certain colors. So again, it's still going to do it by hue range, but if I wanted to raise the luminance of this particular yellow, I can select it and raise it up. But you can see that's also affecting some other areas of the photos. So this actually works best when you have some really spot colors that aren't happening very much in other places. I'm just going to zero all that out. Underneath here you have detail. This is a really good place to just add a little bit of sharpening. If your photo is lacking a sharp quality, you can turn this up a little bit higher. By default, it sets it at 25, which is actually pretty good, but 50 to 60 will give you even more sharpening, which is sometimes nice. And then noise reduction, both in luminance, which is that kind of noisy, grainy noise, and then color noise, which is where you kind of get all those colored speckles. So if you raise any of these sliders up, it'll apply that noise reduction. The downside to this is it'll also get rid of some of your detail, so you have to use it cautiously, and you don't want to use it unnecessarily. Underneath that, you have lens corrections. This is a great area. I love this enable profile corrections, which basically has a list of all the common lenses, and from the metadata, it can figure out what lens you're using and then apply a corrective filter that cancels out any distortion or vignetting that is caused by the lens. So you can see when I click this on and off, there's a little bit of distortion that is being canceled out. That's because the lens by default had a little bit of barrel distortion, and so that barrel distortion is being covered up. There's also a setting for remove chromatic aberration, so if you have any of that color fringing, this will help you remove that as well. Under manual, you can also remove the lens problems manually, but generally speaking, if you're using a pretty common lens, there should be a profile for the lens you're using, so you can usually just do it automatically. And then lastly, you have transform. This is a really useful area, especially for top-downs and also architectural photography, because it allows you to correct for perspective issues. So a lot of times with top-downs, you're trying to shoot from an exactly straight down angle. You're also trying to shoot not from off to the side, but from directly, in the middle of the composition. But it's sometimes hard to get that exactly right. So vertical can correct for those errors. So you can see if I start changing vertical, it just sort of swings the photo, and it's almost like if the camera was in a different position when it was shot. So I'll go back to 0 here, and you can see that there's a little bit of like converging lines that are coming in. Okay, so I can move this to the plus direction to start like swinging that photo out to correct for some of those issues. And then same with horizontal, there's a little bit of converging lines happening. So if I go in the plus direction in this case, it's going to correct for some of those problems. And then rotate is obviously something that's really important too. If your horizon line isn't straight, or you're just a little bit rotated off from where you want to be, you can use this to fix that issue. So a lot of times, a combination of these things will get you so that you're perfectly squared off in the composition. All right, so those are the basic tools. There is a bunch more stuff in here, but I don't want to show you everything. You can definitely kind of go through this and play around with things. Everything in here is non-destructive, so there's nothing you can really do to mess up your photo. It's never going to actually edit the original RAW file. You can actually see all the history of every adjustment that I've made since I started this process. So all the adjustments are in here, and you can even create snapshots. If you want to save a certain configuration, you can always jump back to that snapshot to load up the way the photo looked at that moment. But again, it's never going to actually burn in any of those adjustments to the raw image unless you export specifically, to a burned in image file. So last thing I'm going to do to this is just crop in a little bit, because since we use that, correction tool, there's a little bit of white over here. So we have to kind of just crop in, and I'm leaving this locked so that I maintain my aspect ratio. Okay, maybe a little bit of rotation. I don't think I nailed exactly the corrections, but you can work at it to get it a little closer, because this is kind of moving a little bit away from the bottom of the shot. But that's pretty close, and it definitely looks better than the original. If I hit reset, you can see that it was kind of dark, it was kind of flat, there was some issues with the lighting, and then when I undo that reset, I'm getting much more detail. It feels much more punchy, and it's just way more crisp. It feels really cleaned up. So this is a pretty successful edit. And then when I'm ready to export, I can just right click on this photo and then go to export, export again. And then you can go in here and, put things in whatever subfolder you want, name things in different ways, and then also select the type of image that you want to choose. So if you choose original, you'll actually export the NEF file without any of the corrections, because NEF files never change. So generally speaking, I recommend exporting a TIFF, which will be uncompressed, and that'll allow you to have a really high quality version of your file with all the adjustments burned in. You can also resize, but I generally like to uncheck this just to get, a full resolution image. And then the rest of these settings don't really matter, but there are some other useful settings in here for copyright and for certain types of sharpening. Then when you're ready with all that, you can click export, and it'll process those files. They'll be ready to use.